We now turn to our front bench speeches. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to echo the previous honourable gentleman in thanking the honourable member for Chelmsford for bringing this debate forward today. And it is true that in amongst all the various aspects of Brexit, we must not underestimate the very important matter of consumer protection. And these vital matters are so wound up around and so ingrained into our daily lives that there is a danger that we may take these protections for granted. But this, of course, must not be the case, as the Honourable Lady for Macclesfield has pointed out. Currently, the rights of consumers are enshrined in EU law, so naturally there's bound to be concern and uncertainty about what will become of those rights and the responsibilities of businesses post-Brexit. What we need, of course, is clarity. At the moment, the UK has to comply with EU consumer policy and law, which is estimated to affect around 90 pieces of legislation, making up the body of EU law designed to protect consumers. Yet the EU Withdrawal Bill, currently progressing through Parliament, would repeal the European Communities Act of 1972 and copy all EU legislation into UK law. The concern is that appeals, repeals and amendments and revisions could then be made to consumer law by any government of the day as they saw fit. The lack of clarity and the uncertainty that Brexit has meant is a cause of great concern, since we simply do not know what leaving the EU will mean for consumers and businesses. Will the UK stay in the single market? It looks as though that will not happen. So the rights of consumers in the UK will not be enhanced. They will not keep pace with the rights of consumers in the EU. And that will leave UK consumers potentially exposed and lacking protection. And of course we know that consumers are already feeling the Brexit pinch, even though we haven't yet left the EU. We have the devalued pound pushing up inflation, and that on its own has reduced purchasing power. Most consumers don't really think too much about consumer protection until they need it. And we only have to look at the recent cancellation of Ryanair flights to find a very good example of why consumers benefit from being part of the EU single market and share the same rights and protections across the EU. And the personal example given to us by the Honourable Lady has brought that point home very, very strongly today, and has also been touched upon by the Honourable Member for Bristol North West, although he has gone further and outlined various sharp practices that some airlines indulge in. Fundamentally, what would put a lot of minds at rest is an end to the uncertainty, for consumers to know that the United Kingdom Government is willing to absolutely guarantee that consumer rights and protections will not be watered down post-Brexit, and that it will provide specific assurances of this in the EU Withdrawal Bill. What we need is a cast-iron guarantee that current protections derived from EU legislation will remain in force. Now, I fully understand that the Government's position is that it does not want a black hole in the statute book, and it will convert EU laws into UK laws. However, in the longer term, no one in this room, no one can predict the impact that Brexit will have on consumers, since we don't know what the UK's future relationship with the EU will look like, and even whether the UK will retain any access, if any, to the single market. What can be said is that from the time of withdrawal from the European Union, the consumer protection legislation of the EU and the UK are very likely to drift apart over time. And I fully concur with the member for Bristol North West and the Honourable Lady who talked about the evolution of consumer law. Even if the UK autonomously adopts all EU legislation in the field of consumer protection, even if that were to happen, the interpretation of such legislation will differ, as the UK courts will not be subordinate to the EU court, the European Court of Justice. And this is despite what the member for Auckland South Perthshire has said. So we don't know what kind of divergence will take place. I will indeed.
Does the Honourable Lady recognise that actually, in the example that I used, it showed the UK actually going above and beyond what the EU was putting forward? So actually, if the Honourable Lady would like to be stronger for Scotland, maybe she could start engaging positively with these details and look at the opportunities we have, rather than always look at the negative and trying to do the UK down.
Well, I have to say, I listened very, very carefully to what the Honourable Member said at that point, because this is a point I had in my head. But what I would say is, you cannot negate the very legitimate concerns that I have raised by simply saying, we'll always go one better. I will give the Honourable Gentleman a concrete example. We know that there are fears in some quarters of a race to the bottom, for example on the issue of food safety. The Secretary of State for Trade that is currently serving in the UK Government has said he is, quote, completely relaxed about a diminution of food safety. So you cannot simply hide behind the fact all the time that the UK will always be better than anything that is offered by the EU. I think that's asking us to take too much on trust. I will press on if the Honourable Gentleman will permit. Consumers in the UK spend £1,160 billion each year on goods and services, and currently around 14.8 billion of that is the estimated value of consumer detriment that needs to be tackled by consumer protection bodies. That's with the current protections. A diminution of any of these protections can only increase consumer detriment and undermine consumer confidence. With the increasing complex and wide-ranging threats, in particular with a rise in e-commerce and scams, consumer protection needs to be as robust and match-fit for the modern world as it possibly can be. The UK consumer cannot be left behind post-Brexit. Mr Chair, I would contend that remaining a member of the single market would guarantee that UK consumer protection law moves in line with the rest of the EU, and would certainly reassure consumers and businesses that the current framework would continue and keep pace. Regardless of what the future relations between the UK and the EU finally look like, the laws governing relations between consumers and businesses are of vital importance to the future success of the UK as a whole. Consumers must have confidence in the purchases they make. They must be confident about the safety and confident of redress if anything goes wrong with the goods they purchase. They must be confident that their rights as consumers are enforceable. My concern is that the uncertainty surrounding these rights, which will be down to the whim of any particular government of the day, and that these rights may be diluted or eroded over time as the EU moves ahead in this area, leaving UK consumers' rights behind on the agenda, behind the curve, looking outdated and not fit for purpose in the modern world. And I hope today that the Minister can provide cast-iron assurances that protecting and maintaining consumer rights are very, very firmly on the Government's agenda as Brexit unfolds, because consumers have a right to expect nothing less.